I'm going to try to give you a short introduction to the idea of how do we choose literary works that we study. As you know, in this course, we've read a variety of things, 19th century, 20th century, some British fiction, some American fiction, and we've even read some 21st century stories. One of the issues that this raises is who chooses this stuff. In my case, I choose these from our textbook. I chose the textbook. And I also chose the extra stories that we read. You all exercised some canonical choice when I gave you a list of um, electronic books that we could study, and the majority of you who voted for The Great Gatsby, which is what we did during week 7. So now, to help us get ready for the final exam, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the things that we take into account when we talk about the choosing of literary works that are valuable enough for us to come back to and study. The word canon comes from the Latin word for rule. And the idea behind the canon was that these would be works that would be studied from year to year, decade to decade, century to century. Works of literature that people felt had lasting value, that were worthy of the attention of both students in terms of giving them a cultural heritage or an understanding of the background from which they come, as well as the kinds of things that literary scholars study that are deep enough and complex enough and interesting enough to come back to over and over again. As you can see here, I mentioned that it used to be this was a fairly consistent process, and pretty much since the 1960s in particular, this has become a much more complex and fraught process. One of the things that we may or may not know, or you may or may not know, is that most of the writers that we're dealing with in this course in their own time were not recognized as people who were going to be studied for decades and decades and decades. Excuse me. As I said, in the 1960s, this became a very complex enterprise. I should mention I started college in 1969. I graduated in 1973, just as things in the world of canon selection were beginning to loosen up. I can tell you that before World War II, which was when most of my professors went to college, um, American literature was not regarded as particularly on the same level as British literature. And so if you were going to be an English major in 1950, you probably would have read far more British literature than American literature, with the exception of someone like Poe, Whitman, Melville, Emily Dickinson. Those would have been the American writers that you would have read. But you would have taken a course in Shakespeare, probably more than one. You would have taken a course in Chaucer with the Canterbury Tales in Middle English. You would have taken a course in Milton. You would have taken an 18th century course. You would have taken a Victorian literature course and a English Romantics course. And you can see here some of the authors that you would have read. These days, you won't run into that so much. So the next question this raises is, how large should the canon be, and who gets to decide? I mean, we have one textbook. If I picked a different book, we would have had many of the same selections, but we would have had additional ones that we may not have thought about. One of the things that comes up a lot of times is, are there certain forms of language that are proscribed these days? For instance, Twain used to be a feature of American literature courses, and more he is coming out because of his use of the N-word frequently in Huckleberry Finn and somewhat in Tom Sawyer. And so there are a lot of scholars now who say, well, maybe Twain, because of this language, shouldn't be in the canon anymore. I tend to think that he reflects the racism of his time. And Twain himself was not a racist. But once you start defending somebody on that kind of basis, then pretty soon you get involved in this sort of word count arguments that don't really seem to lead us anywhere. The N-word, of course, came up in Eudora Welty's story. A couple of years ago when I taught this course, I had 2 African-American women students who really took offense at it. And when they came time for writing their essays about the canon, one of them chose to exclude Welty solely on the basis of her, what the student perceived as her attitude towards race. So that comes up from time to time, particularly in contemporary times. Gender and sexuality, to transgender writers, to gay writers, to lesbian writers, to queer writers, who've traditionally been left out of the canon or have been seen as second-rate writers. Do we let them in? And do we let them in partly because they present a sexuality that is not the norm or what we tend to think of as the norm? And does their fiction reflect that sexuality in any way? Um, are there other elements of biography that might make them a candidate for the canon who they might not have been a few years ago? Um, a lot of people use the term test of time, but that doesn't really mean anything, because again, we tend to study works because these are the works that we were taught, or these are the works that were important when we were in college or to the people who taught us. And so there's a certain arbitrariness to this idea of test of time, that it may be that we study something just because we've been studying it for decades. And so that's an interesting question. Does the work itself have any organic quality in terms of language or plot or character, which I'll talk all about a little bit later, that make them something that can withstand multiple readings over multiple decades? And then a final question is, what should people read to be considered educated? It's a question of, if you read nothing but popular fiction, and I read a lot of that, a lot of contemporary detective novels and thrillers. I read almost nothing but that outside of what I read for work. And I tend to read a lot of fairly serious nonfiction too. You know, should those guys make the cut, or should they be put aside and not considered the kind of reading that somebody who's quote unquote educated should read? I don't know if you notice this down here in the bottom. These are 5 of the richest authors in the world right now. And one of the questions that I pose to you is whether you can name them all. This one you probably know first. This is J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter writer. But the other ones you might not be so familiar with. Some of you may know who this is. This is Stephen King. A few of you may know who this is. This is John Grisham, the legal thriller writer. This woman here is E.L. James, the person who wrote the Shades of Grey series, which I think more people have read at Barnes & Noble than have actually ever bought. But apparently, between the book sales and the movie rights, she's one of the top 10 richest writers in the world. And this is Dan Brown, the person who wrote the Da Vinci Code and a variety of other thrillers. So these are works that are read, they're popular, they sell millions of copies, their works have been made into films. But no one would put these guys into the canon unless they were putting together some kind of a special topics course on, I don't know, boarding school fiction in the case of Harry Potter, or books about magic, or books about legal studies, or legal scholars, or lawyers who just write novels. E.L. James might make it if we were looking at books about or putting together a course where we were trying to define what's the difference between pornography and not, perhaps. If we were doing horror, would we put Stephen King in there, or would we put Karen Russell? That's kind of an interesting question to me. But these are all the kinds of decisions that people in my line of work, not me personally because I'm not an editor, or somebody who selects textbooks, except for courses like ours, these are the kinds of questions that people in my profession wrestle with all the time. Who gets in? Who gets out? Do we throw somebody out to make room for somebody else? And what kind of criteria do we use? Some of the things that many people consider when they think about the canon is they look at things like the complexity of language. Is the language rich and elusive and complex and worthy of study? I would say a story like The Dead, which many of you were not as excited by as I am, has an extraordinary use of language. It's the only story we've read this semester that every time I get to the end of it, I want to start reading it again immediately. The Great Gatsby also has an extraordinarily complex use of language, and there's a certain beauty to it, I think, that many other writers, Kate Chopin, for instance, simply don't use or don't choose to employ. So language could be a criteria. How well do they use the language? How well do they present the richness and complexity and depth of English? Okay. A second question, and this is one that I think is interesting, is the depth of character. Is a character complex? Do they have multiple sides? Do they have the kind of personality that we would find interesting over the long term? Someone like Bobineau, for instance, I think may not be considered a very deep character. Someone like either of the Annas in the two Lady with a Pet Dog stories that we read, those are some pretty deep characters. Connie in Oates's story, Where Have You Been, Where You're Going, to me has some complex character. I think because Oates spends so much time inside her head. And so we're presented with character depth there in a way that perhaps we don't see when we see Meyer Wolfsheim, for instance, or I'm trying to think of somebody else, but we'll just leave it at that. The plot, is the plot straightforward? Is it simple? Is it complex in a way that seems to be complex for its own sake? Is it complicated and hard to follow? Or is the plot something that supports the development of character and raises the kinds of larger thematic questions that we frequently look at? And then deeper resonances. And again, this is like test of time. It's kind of an English teacher term for things that we like in stories, things that we come back to over and over again. For instance, one of the themes that we've talked about in this course frequently is marriage and what kind of marriages people have. We see Aylmer and Georgiana having one kind of marriage. We have Norma Jean and Leroy, a different kind of marriage. We have the Monarchs as another kind of marriage. And so many times when we look at stories and we look at something as common as a marriage, we tend to think of that as a conventional way of living. But then we look at, well, how do people get along in a marriage? And does this story tell me anything about marriages that I didn't know before? You could make the same kinds of assertions about things like masculinity or feminine, or about the nature of art, or the nature of horror, or the nature of fantasy, or the nature of science fiction. And we all know that there are science fiction writers that are, some are just better than others. Some have stood out for a long period of time. Same thing with fantasy, same thing with horror. Those are genres I don't spend a lot of time with, so I don't really want to get into those. I'm not competent to discuss them, but those are the kind of resonances that we tend to think about. This is kind of the bottom line of these different kinds of stories. The story has to matter outside the limits of the text itself. I read a tremendous amount of British detective fiction. I love them. I can't get enough of them. But as soon as I stop, I'm ready to read another one. I read them because of the plot. I read them because of the setting and the language. But they don't have the depth of character, the complexity of the stories that we've been dealing with, particularly the ones that I think have mattered the most, to me anyway. The Dead is one of those stories. As I said, Sonny's Blues is one of those stories. Gatsby is one of those stories that I've read over and over and over again, and I never get tired of it. So those are the kinds of questions that those stories raise, are these big ones about human relationships and about our society and how humans conduct themselves in the world, and that sort of thing. I'll get to another list of these here in a minute. And then this last category here, this idea that comes from St. Augustine, the 5th century great Christian writer, when he says that literature's function is to teach and delight. And his example of that actually is Scripture. It's the Old and New Testament, which is a literary work that I studied in college as a literary work, not as a religious text. And that, I think, is something that you could argue is a canonical text, although not everybody would agree with me. Here are some other ideas. And again, there's no one list, although I'll give you a possible set of 4 criteria at the end from one of the authors that we have here. Here's one, that books have to have a clear moral point of view. And if you think about it, in the Gatsby, the guy who gets punished, Gatsby and George Wilson, are the people who have not really committed a crime in the way that Tom and Daisy might be considered to have committed an error, or Myrtle commits an error, or certainly Meyer Wolfsheim commits crimes all the way through. And so the question there is that we get to the end of the story and we think, oh my God, the wrong guy's been punished. Nick tells us he's the best of them all. And I think given the context of the story, we could certainly make that case. We know, for instance, that Jordan Baker is someone who cheats at golf. She's somebody who cheats at the professional sport that she plays. So, is she entitled to a happy ending, to use Margaret Atwood's term. Morally, perhaps not. So maybe that's why things end the way that they do between her and Nick. Um, Again, I've already talked about this idea about previously marginalized authors. Did they get to fit? James Baldwin, who we read with Sonny's Blues, is not only an African American who spent much of his life in Paris, where he felt much more at home, but he was also a gay man who wrote about gay characters, not in the story that we read, but in some other works that he has. And this was very transgressive for the late 50s, early 60s. He was also a remarkable social critic. And if you've never read something like The Fire Next Time, you really ought to get a sense of what an extraordinarily complex thinker Baldwin was. But does that let him in? You know, or does he subordinate plot, character, theme, all that kind of stuff to some kind of political or sociological point that he wants to make? I think the answer is no on that, but not everybody would agree. Should we take people who use really unusual forms? Kafka, of course, is the best example of that. Gabriel Maria Marquez does that in a sense with the old man with enormous wings. Do we let them in just because they're different, because they're unique? A fourth item here might be, do they have some historical value that we see reflected in writing of our own time that appeared in the past? And is there kind of a continuity there? Is there an influence from the past that gets brought forward to the present? We see this, of course, with Shakespeare. The Lion King, for instance, there's a new version of The Lion King, is a retelling of the story Hamlet, which is a story that he stole from somebody else. So we have that kind of influential text that goes down for centuries. Sometimes it's the contemporaneity of something, somebody who reflects what's going on in our own particular time, what's going on at this moment. Orange World might be an example of that. And you could argue that by holding up a mirror in the way that fiction does to contemporary times and contemporary concerns, that maybe that's a work that deserves study, that a work that deserves to be included in the canon. I still think it has to have those same elements of a plot that's interesting, compelling characters, and a highly developed use of language, but not everybody would agree with that. So this is kind of the opposite of the previous point that I make about historical value. Sometimes works can be so new, so interesting, so exciting, or so much reflect their times. And Gatsby may very well fall into that category, that we study them in part just because of that. A last point here comes from F.R. Leavis, a British critic who's kind of like Cleanth Brooks, the one I mentioned earlier. He says that every literary work must demonstrate a reverent openness before life. And I think what he means there is that it should show us all the kinds of experiences of life that our lives offer ourselves. And so you might want to think about that. The article I refer to here is one that I've posted to Blackboard in the week 8 area. I'll show you that in a minute. John Fordresher, who's this gentleman down here in the right-hand side, is a literary scholar. I think we're actually the same age. I'm not sure. So we were trained probably at the same time in the same way. And he teaches at Georgetown. And he wrote an article that has 4 criteria for choosing works for literary canon. And I've included his article in the week 8 items that you can take a look at. But here they are. In constructing or reconstructing a literary canon, that is choosing works, let's look for texts that explore emotion, intuition, mystery, the numinous, and the transcendent. And I think almost all the works in our course meet those standards in some way, that particular standard. They're all about emotion, they're about intuition, ours and the characters, the mystery of how things happen and why they happen. And what I think sometimes about mystery means that your work can have multiple readings, and no one reading is sufficient to encompass all of the language, the plot, the characters, and the other elements that make fiction fiction. His second point is, let's look for texts concerned with language as language. And again, I've talked about this a little bit already, the gorgeous language that Joyce uses, the gorgeous language that Fitzgerald uses in their works, among many of the other writers that we have in this course. Let's remain alert, he says, number 3, to the fundamental importance of figurative language. This is language that evokes an image in our heads that creates an idea or a person or a character or an event just through the very simple choosing of particular words and particular details, not describing the whole thing like a police report, but rather enough to evoke an image in our heads in a way um, that is economical in a sense. This is perhaps more important for poetry than it is for fiction, but I think fiction has to be interesting to read, not just in terms of plot or interesting characters, but the words themselves have to have value to us. And one of the things I don't like about John Grisham, for instance, is I find his books just long, and in the sentences themselves, I don't find that interesting. But again, I have my own trashy novel writers that I like to read, and Grisham would probably say that those guys can't write very well either. And I would probably agree with him. That really is a matter of taste. Fourth, and this is the last point that Fordresher makes, we need to keep in mind the ways that a specific text positions itself in relationship to other works of literature, especially to other works in its genre. And here we've been dealing with short stories mostly. We've almost all short stories. We have what some people will call a novella, the Dead, and we've had The Great Gatsby, a novel. So all of those are works of literary fiction, which is a big category, and the subcategory of short story, by and large, is what we've been reading, except for those two exceptions. So this is his criteria: is how does it fit with other works that are similar to it? Does it show itself off well? And he gives you some more descriptive information in the article. So you should read that before you attempt your own criteria. This is the last of the slides, and these are who these people are. This is Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, the man who wrote the Canterbury Tales, a great exemplar of Middle English. This is John Milton, the man who wrote Paradise Lost, and an extraordinary range of other poems. And of course, William Shakespeare, the man who wrote all the plays that we still keep studying. So if you were wondering what the canon looked like in 1969 when I started, these were the three big guns. And our course, of course, has branched out considerably from these folks. We're at the bottom of the course content area in Blackboard. This is week 8, the final examination. If you click on that, you'll see these items. If it opens, you'll see the discussion board question in blue. That's due on Tuesday. That asks you to develop 1 to 3 criteria, and I had 3 stories here: The Real Thing, Orange World, and A Metamorphosis. And so I think if you wanted to exercise a little bit here, just put these 3 in order and explain why, and say what's the criteria you're choosing. Are you choosing language? Are you choosing gender criticism? What are you doing exactly in there? So that's how you would deal with that. Pick one of those topics, one of those criteria, and see if you can apply it. Here's the final examination itself, which is ask you to write an essay and upload it like you would do a paper. I would expect about 2 pages in here, and I would expect the first part of it to lay out your criteria, and then to say, here's the work that fits my criteria and why we should keep it, and here's a work that doesn't fit 1 or more of my criteria and why we should get rid of it. So your essay should be structured pretty straightforwardly. Here's criteria, here's one that fits, here's one that doesn't fit, and then you explain why they fit or don't fit, and then come to a short conclusion. Okay, so that's what this is. The last part down here is this literary canon part. If you click on this last green link, you'll see these kinds of articles. These are ones about the literary canon. As you can see, curricular canon with academic programs, the canon wars, canon syllabus list, a very long and complex but interesting article if you like it. Literary valuing, that's another way of thinking about the canon. This is about how do you put together anthologies. And this is called Placing the Margins, Literary Reviews, Pedagogical Practices, and the Canon of Victorian Women's Writing. This is where Chopin fits in, and the writer here sets some really interesting criteria for this group of fiction, but it may be applicable to other ones. That's why I put it in here. But these things probably get less valuable to you in terms of finishing the exam as you go down. The ones that you might want to think about is this one. And this is the Fordresher article that explains the 4 criteria that I just talked about. earlier in the slide part of the video. So you have all these resources. You can look at none of them and just do this all on your own. You can do this by taking a look at one or two of these articles to get some ideas. You should see by Monday some items posted here, some student exams from previous courses. I can't find them. That's why they're not posted already, but I'll have them probably Monday because I think they're on my work computer. I'll find out. Okay. But this again is one of the items that's in the week 8 area. Okay. So don't be afraid to send me a note asking me questions. Don't be afraid to write a draft and send it to me by Wednesday so that I can get it back to you by Friday when the 2nd, when the paper is due. So don't let this be a mystery, but don't make it too hard. As I said, 2 pages is kind of what I'm looking for here. I think that's enough. An exam in our system is 1 hour and 50 minutes, and I think you should be able to write 2 pages in that amount of time. You can spend as much time as you want writing it. Again, you're just submitting the final 2 or 3 pages, whatever you decide it is. And again, I would set it up very simply. Here's my criteria. Here's why they're important. Here's how this story fits. Here's how this story does not fit. The end. Okay. So thank you for your attention.